In the ancient Greek city of Athens, where marble temples rose above crowded streets and public debate shaped everyday life, a man appeared who would forever change the way human beings think. He owned no wealth, held no political office, and wrote no books. Yet his words unsettled the powerful and awakened the minds of the young. His name was Socrates. Socrates was born around 469 BCE near Athens. His father, Socrates, was a stonecutter, a man who shaped raw stone into lasting form. His mother, Philosopher, was a midwife, helping bring new life into the world. These two professions quietly reflected the future path of their son. Socrates would later describe his own work as similar to midwifery, not creating ideas, but helping others give birth to the truth already hidden within their minds. Athens at this time stood at the center of the Greek world. Victorious after the Persian Wars, the city had grown powerful, confident, and proud of its democracy. Art, drama, politics, and philosophy flourished. But beneath this glory, Socrates sensed something deeply wrong. People spoke confidently about justice, virtue, honor, and wisdom, yet when questioned, their certainty quickly collapsed. Socrates made it his mission to expose this false knowledge. He walked through markets, gymnasiums, and public squares, stopping politicians, poets, soldiers, and craftsmen. His questions were simple but unsettling. What is justice? What is courage? What is goodness? As people answered, Socrates gently pressed further, revealing contradictions and confusion. This method did not aim to humiliate, but to awaken. Unlike other teachers of his time, Socrates never charged money and never claimed to possess wisdom. His most famous declaration, "I know that I know nothing," was not an admission of defeat, but the starting point of true philosophy. To Socrates, the greatest danger was not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. During this period, sophists were highly influential in Athens. They taught young men how to argue persuasively and win public debates, often without concern for truth. Socrates openly opposed them. He believed that skillful speech without moral purpose was dangerous, and that knowledge separated from virtue would corrupt both individuals and the state. Socrates himself lived a life of extreme simplicity. He dressed plainly, walked barefoot, and ignored wealth and comfort. His physical appearance was often mocked, yet his presence was powerful. Those who spoke with him felt challenged, disturbed, and transformed. He taught that caring for the soul was far more important than caring for the body or chasing material success. His philosophy centered on ethics. Socrates believed that no one knowingly chooses evil. Wrongdoing, in his view, came from ignorance. If a person truly understood what was good, they would act accordingly. Therefore, the highest task of human life was self-examination. A life without reflection, he argued, was not worth living. Socrates was not only a philosopher, but also a citizen. He served Athens in military campaigns and showed great courage under fire. Yet his greatest bravery appeared in civic life, where he refused to follow the crowd when he believed the crowd was wrong. He obeyed his conscience even when it isolated him. Young Athenians, especially those from influential families, were drawn to Socrates. They followed him, listened to his conversations, and learned to question authority. This growing influence quietly changed the intellectual atmosphere of Athens. What began as conversations in public places was slowly becoming a movement of critical thinking that challenged long-held assumptions about knowledge, virtue, and power. Socrates stood at a point where his questions were no longer merely philosophical exercises, but had begun to challenge the democratic foundations of Athens. The atmosphere of the city was changing. Athens, which was once considered a cradle of free thought, dialogue, and dissent, had now internally become vulnerable. To understand this change, we must look at the political and social environment in which Socrates was breathing. The Peloponnesian Wars had torn Athens from within. Prolonged war, economic hardship, political conspiracies, and repeated changes of government had demoralized the people. Democracy sometimes grew strong, and sometimes it was held hostage by a few powerful individuals. In such a situation, Socrates' statement that the majority is not always right was unbearable for many. For the protectors of democracy, this statement felt like an open attack. Socrates' question was not about who should rule, but about how wise and moral the ruler should be. He said that just as the leadership of a ship should be in the hands of an expert sailor, similarly the leadership of the state should be entrusted to competent and virtuous people, not only to those who have public popularity. This idea sounded reasonable, but in democratic politics, it became a deadly poison. Socrates often surrounded himself with young people. These young men belonged to elite families, including controversial but talented figures like Socrates taught these young people to question, to examine tradition, and to realize that not every famous saying is true. The elder class found this the most unbearable. They felt that Socrates was inciting the new generation to rebellion. Interestingly, Socrates did not call himself a teacher. He said that he taught no one, he only asked questions, but the truth was that his questions stirred minds. When young people asked their fathers and grandfathers the same questions Socrates had taught them, tension began to arise within households. In this way, Socrates' dialogue disrupted even private lives. Socrates' relationship with religion also became a sensitive issue. Athens was a city of gods, where every action was attributed to the will of the gods. Socrates did not deny the existence of gods, but he questioned traditional religious stories. He said that if a god also committed injustice, then that god is not worthy of being called a god. This was unforgivable for priests and religious circles. Socrates spoke of his inner inspiration, which he called the daemonion. According to him, this was an inner voice that prevented him from doing wrong. Opponents began to use this idea as a basis to claim that Socrates was introducing new gods. Thus, the charge of religious rebellion gradually began to strengthen against him. On the fronts of politics, religion, and ethics, Socrates was becoming increasingly isolated. Nevertheless, he did not remain silent. He continued to question people in markets, outside courts, and in the gymnasiums. He believed that even if the price of speaking the truth was his life, paying that price was wisdom. Some powerful individuals in Athens had now decided to silence this quiet philosopher. People like Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon began to unite against him. Their claim was that Socrates was corrupting the youth and denying the gods of the state. These accusations were seemingly religious, but behind them lay political fear. Socrates' response here is noteworthy. He did not choose to leave the city or remain silent. He said that if he stopped questioning, he would betray his soul. He understood that Athens needed him, even if Athens itself did not realize it. At this stage of the episode, Socrates' life was moving toward a decisive turn. The charges had been made, the atmosphere had formed, and now the matter was no longer just about philosophy. In the next episode, we will see how these accusations take the form of a historic trial, and Socrates appears before the court of Athens for the first time. The accusations against Socrates were no longer mere whispers, but had taken the form of a formal trial. The court of Athens, which citizens proudly considered a symbol of their democracy, was now about to decide the fate of a man who had spent his entire life questioning that very democracy. This moment was decisive not only for Socrates, but also for the intellectual history of Athens. The trial was not of a common nature. Socrates faced two main charges. The first was that he did not acknowledge the state-recognized gods and introduced new divine concepts, and the second was that he corrupted the youth. On the surface, these charges appeared religious and moral in nature, but behind them lay political fear and social insecurity. Hundreds of jury members were present in the court, composed of ordinary citizens. These were the people who considered themselves protectors of the state. Socrates had to present his defense before them, but his defense was not like that of an ordinary defendant. He neither appealed for mercy, nor gave an emotional speech, nor tried to gather sympathy by bringing his children in front. He did exactly what he had done all his life. He asked questions. Socrates began his speech by stating that the accusations against him were not new, but the result of long-standing prejudices. He said that the real harm had been done by those who had portrayed him as a dangerous intellectual for years. He made it clear that he did not consider himself wise, but acknowledged his own ignorance. According to him, this very acknowledgement was his greatest wisdom. On this occasion, he mentioned the oracle of Delphi, where his friend had asked whether there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The answer came, no. Socrates said that to understand this prophecy, he questioned politicians, poets, and craftsmen, and found that all of them were under a misunderstanding about their own knowledge. Thus, he concluded that perhaps the gods meant that a person is wise who knows his own ignorance. Socrates asked direct questions to his accusers, particularly Meletus. He asked that if he is corrupting the youth, then who is guiding them, the entire state or just a few individuals? In this logical cross-examination, Meletus' answers began to falter, and many present in the court began to realize for the first time that this trial was not as simple as it appeared. Regarding the religious charge, Socrates said that he did not deny the gods but believed in their moral greatness. If he spoke of the daemonion, it too came within the divine concept, not outside it. He argued that a person who believes in spiritual beings cannot be a denier of divine power. Throughout this dialogue, Socrates' tone was confident yet challenging. He had not come to please the court but to speak the truth. He clearly stated that even if he were released on the condition that he stopped questioning, he would not accept this condition. For him, questioning was his moral duty. When it came time to announce the verdict, it was decided by voting whether Socrates was guilty or not. The decision went against Socrates by a narrow margin. This was the moment when many expected Socrates to soften, but here the most remarkable aspect of his personality emerged. According to the law, after being found guilty, the defendant had the right to propose a penalty. Socrates sarcastically said that he should not be punished but honored, and the state should provide him free meals in return for his service. For many jury members, this was tantamount to an insult. Ultimately, the death penalty was proposed, and this time the vote went against Socrates by a much larger margin. Thus, the court of Athens delivered its decision that Socrates would be given a cup of poison to drink and die. With this verdict, Socrates' life entered a new phase. He was no longer a free citizen, but a prisoner, yet his conscience remained free. In the next episode, we will see how Socrates spent his final days in prison, how he viewed death, and why his silent smile became history's highest proclamation. Socrates had been sentenced to death. The court of Athens had delivered its verdict, yet for Socrates this decision was not an end, but the beginning of a new dialogue, one that this time he had to conduct not with the crowd, the court, or the city, but with his soul, his friends, and death itself. The prison where Socrates was held was outwardly narrow and dark, but intellectually, it became the brightest school in history. According to the law, the execution could not be carried out immediately, because a sacred ship had set sail for Delos, and until it returned, no one was allowed to be put to death. This interval gave Socrates a few days that would later be counted among the most valuable moments in philosophy. Socrates' friends and disciples, especially Crito, visited him daily. Crito was a practical-minded person who loved Socrates immensely. One night he secretly came to the prison and laid out a plan of escape before Socrates. Guards could be bribed, friends were ready to help, and Socrates could easily leave the city. Crito argued that if Socrates died, people would think that his friends had not even tried to save him. This was the moment where Socrates' moral philosophy emerged in full force. He asked Crito whether it is right to respond to injustice with injustice. Should a philosopher break the law merely to save his own life? Socrates said that if he refused to accept the court's decision, he would harm the very state in which he had lived his entire life. Socrates presented the law as a living entity, as if it were speaking itself. He said that the laws had protected him since childhood. Under these laws he had married, had children, and obtained civic rights. If now he were to break these laws merely because the decision went against him, it would contradict his own teachings. Crito fell silent. He had no further argument, because he realized that for Socrates, ethics held a place far above emotions. Socrates said that the purity of the soul is more important than the survival of the body, and if the body must be sacrificed to save the soul, it is not a costly trade. During the days in prison, Socrates' demeanor was remarkably calm. He joked with friends, discussed philosophical questions, and occasionally spoke about music. He said that throughout his life he had followed logic and reason, but now he also wanted to understand beauty and harmony. Socrates' view of death was free from fear. For him, death was either a deep sleep with no dreams, or the soul's transition to a world where dialogue with great people is possible. In both cases, it was not frightening, but acceptable. He said that someone who has lived a life of virtue has no reason to fear death. Time passed, and the day approached when the sacred ship was to return. There was celebration outside the city, but inside the prison silence deepened. Socrates' disciples knew they were seeing their teacher for the last time, yet Socrates himself appeared the most content. Finally, the moment arrived as decided. The prison door opened, and the officials entered, carrying the cup of poison. His voice was filled with gravity, for he too knew that the person standing before him was no ordinary criminal. Socrates took the cup without hesitation. He looked at his friends, spoke a few final words, and counseled them to be patient. He said that crying was not appropriate now, for he was not suffering a loss but moving toward a new reality. Before drinking the cup, he gave one last moral message before the gods, that one should not repay evil with evil. Then he drank the poison. The cold gradually spread through his body, from the feet upward. In that moment, the prison was silent, yet history was speaking. Socrates' last words were full of philosophy, and his death was not the death of an individual but the victory of an idea. Here episode 4 ends. In the next and final episode, we will see how Socrates' thoughts changed the world after his death, what effects he had on Plato and Aristotle, and why Socrates is still considered alive today. Socrates' body had gone silent, yet at that moment his thought entered a new life. A man had died in the prison of Athens, but in history, a chapter had opened that was not to be closed for centuries. Socrates' death certainly gave temporary satisfaction to his enemies, Yet this very decision elevated him from an ordinary philosopher to a symbol of the conscience of humanity. Immediately after Socrates' death, the atmosphere of Athens began to change. Many people realized that by eliminating a questioner, the state had in fact revealed its own weakness. The youth who had been troubled by Socrates' questions until yesterday now began to adopt those very questions as their identity. Instead of suppressing Socrates' name, it began to spread, and his thoughts silently traveled from the walls of Athens into the world. Socrates' greatest legacy was his students. The most prominent among them was Plato, who made the death of his teacher the purpose of his life. Plato left Athens, traveled to various regions, and eventually formed a system of thought in which Socrates always remained the central figure. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates is not merely a character but a living conscience, questioning humans of every age. Plato was the first to formally write philosophy, yet the spirit of this writing remained the Socratic dialogue. The path to truth was not declared as speech but as question and answer. Advancing his teacher's ideas, Plato presented the notion that true knowledge does not exist in the material world but in the world of ideas. Thus, Socrates' thought laid the foundation of a new philosophical structure. Plato's student was Aristotle, who later became regarded as the most influential philosopher in history. Although Aristotle disagreed with his teacher Plato on many matters, the Socratic method of questioning remained embedded in his thinking. The work Aristotle did in logic, ethics, politics, biology, and physics was rooted in the very question, how do we know that what we know is correct? Thus, the intellectual chain Socrates gives Plato gives Aristotle became the backbone of Western philosophy. Later Roman thinkers, Christian philosophers, Muslim philosophers, and modern European scholars all, in one way or another, drew light from Socratic thought. Without the freedom to question, knowledge could never advance. Socrates' greatest achievement was not that he gave answers, but that he gave the courage to ask the right questions. He taught that power, tradition, and the majority can also be wrong. He gave humans the bravery to ask themselves, do I really know that what I believe is true? In the field of ethics, Socrates' influence is still alive today. His notion that evil arises from ignorance is still debated in modern education and psychology. According to him, the only way to improve a human being is not knowledge, but self-knowledge. Until a person recognizes himself, he cannot improve society. Socrates' death also proved that truth can be suppressed but cannot be destroyed. The state may be powerful, but the conscience is more powerful than it. That is why today Socrates is remembered not as a criminal but as a martyr of thought. In the modern world, whenever freedom of expression, the voice of conscience, or the relationship between the state and the individual is discussed, Socrates' name automatically comes to the forefront. The journalists who ask questions, the teachers who teach thinking, and the students who wish to understand rather than memorize all, are in some way heirs of Socrates. Socrates never wrote a book, yet the world's greatest intellectual library is associated with his name. He never established a school, yet every place where questions are asked is a school of Socrates. We come to the conclusion that Socrates was not an individual, but an action, the action of questioning, the action of thinking, and the action of sacrificing for truth. His body merged with the earth, yet his question remains alive today. Do you really know what you know? This very question makes Socrates not a philosopher of the past, but a guide for the present and the future.